John Locke, the originator and forefather of liberalism in all his glory, the thinker that helped to inspire revolutionary action across Europe and the Revolutionary War here in the US. He wrote the script for the ideas that inspired the Constitution, the framework for our entire society. He advocated for life, liberty, and property rights, and he's the thought leader behind the conception and implementation of private property as we know it today. But after all these years, if John Locke was still around somehow, would he be a capitalist? All right, I know most of you watching are probably reactively yelling yes at me. I mean, of course he would be a capitalist, right? I mean, he's coined as the originator of modern liberalism, and what would liberalism be without capitalism? Well, I'm not so sure that John Locke would be a capitalist. And if you want to get active, we can get out. All right, I'm cool. I'm sorry. Now, before you end the video in a fit of rage, just give me some time to explain, and maybe we'll agree a little bit more than you expect, right? So, while I do think John Locke's philosophies were over-dependent on the flawed natural rights laws, which I've talked about in the video I have linked somewhere, it's going to show up. I do tend to agree with John Locke's arguments and rationalizations for property rights, more specifically his labor theory. So basically, Locke argued that when a person applies their labor to a natural resource, that person's labor essentially becomes an inherent property within that resource, and thus that resource is now that person's property, or now the property of the laborer. All right, so here's an example of how the labor theory works in practice. So let's say some innovative woman from early humanity takes some sticks, vines, stones, all of which are natural resources, and labors over them to create what we know as a hammer, right? Now that this brilliant trailblazer has applied her labor to these natural resources, that hammer is her property. In this example, really the only social component is that the natural resources are being taken from a technically social pool. Once you use those resources, they're no longer available for others to use. It's a shared reserve. And Locke made it very clear that this theory only applies so long as there is enough of that resource left in common for others. We'll come back to that. This concept also applies to a plot of land and building a home. So if you till the soil to grow crops, you put a fence up, and then you use lumber to build a house, that's now your property, right? All right, so let's fast forward to today. It's unlikely that we're going to build our own house from the land. Rather, we're going to pay money, right? Which is the representation of someone's labor. And it's most likely your own labor if you're working class. And I do an important side note here. This money does not represent all of your labor either. A portion of the value that your labor generates is appropriated as profit, right? So already you can see how modernly this process differs from Locke's conception of the labor theory, right? In Locke's conception of the labor theory, all of your labor value is returned to you because the product of your labor combined with the natural resources is now your sole property, right? So it's unlikely we will build our own house from the land, but rather we'll pay money, which is a representation of someone's labor, in exchange for a home built by various contributors. So contractor, concrete workers, framers, electricians, so on. And so aside from the labor value that's being appropriated as profit, this still seems reasonably consistent with Locke's labor theory. The biggest difference is that people now specialize their labor and get money in exchange for it, right? And then they exchange that money for products of other people's labor and so on. And I think an accurate way to describe this is that labor has been socialized. Every day you use things like roads, for example, that are a product of someone else's labor, and in most cases, many other labor, much labor. Now, a lot of people's labor goes into most of the things that we use regularly, right? It might require a portion of total required labor from 20, 30, 40, or however many different people to create some of the things that you use. So going back to the hammer as an example, you'll have multiple people cutting down the trees and then working the lumber, and then you'll have others working the steel, and then other people shipping those materials to the manufacturer, and then you have a new worker making the handle, and then another worker making the head, and a mechanic fixing the truck that'll deliver the hammer. And there is rarely an instance where one person is making one hammer from raw materials that they themselves found and allocated. This is the socialization of labor, and I think this process makes perfect sense. It doesn't make sense to try to have an individual try to do everything that's required in their life, right? It's far more efficient to have people specialize their labor and get good at their labor, and for others to do the same in different areas so everyone can efficiently produce the necessary goods and products of society and exchange those goods and products with each other. Now, here's the hiccup between what Locke explained, his labor theory, and how it doesn't translate so well to today with our mass socialization of labor. Now that we live in such a highly developed form of society, it is clear that labor has been socialized en masse, but the allocation of the product of that socialized labor has not. The allocation of resources have not been socialized, and in many cases, the allocation of the labor itself has not been socialized. And although there is technically freedom for modern workers to choose where they work, this only exists in congruence with large-scale coercion. And this is where I think Locke's ideas of private property greatly differ from modern capitalism and liberalism alike, right? Remember when I said that Locke made it very clear that his theory only applies so long as there's enough of a resource left in common for all others? This is what's called the Lockean proviso. The Lockean proviso is one of the most conveniently ignored aspects of Locke's writings, and that's mainly because, well, in a very clear and direct way, it really contradicts the all too important belief that Locke would have been a capitalist, or that he defended capitalism as a concept, or would have defended modern capitalism as a concept. So what is the Lockean proviso? I'll throw up the exact verbiage, but it's basically Locke explicitly stating that his conceptions of property rights are valid only so long as there is enough resources left in common for all others to share the same rights. And I mean, do I really need to provide any further analysis? All right, of course I'm not going to leave you there. Let's do a montage. All right, I'm just kidding. I'm not prepared to edit a montage, but I will give you some B-roll while I go over some of the examples of capitalism not allowing everyone to share the same property rights in common or share in the pool of natural resources in common. Under global capitalism, 9 million people starve to death per year. Under global capitalism, 9 million people starve to death per year, while in the US, approximately 40% of perfectly good and edible food is wasted through our food supply chain. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization argues that, quote, even if just 1/4 of the food currently lost or wasted globally could be saved, it'd be enough to feed 870 million hungry people in the world. Hi guys, this is Editing Danny. So since recording this, the Supreme Court has now ruled that it's constitutional to outlaw homelessness. I'm going to read a quote directly from an NPR article. It just kind of breaks it down. In its quote, in its biggest decision on homelessness in decades, the U.S. Supreme Court today ruled that cities can ban people from sleeping and camping in public spaces. The justices, in a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, overturned lower court rulings that deemed it cruel and unusual under the Eighth Amendment to punish people for sleeping outside if they had nowhere else to go, unquote. So keep that in mind as I speak on this issue. And it's also worth noting that outlawing homelessness, when homeless people do in fact exist, is a direct attack with threat of physical harm up to death against a specific cohort of American citizens based specifically on class lines. This decision will result in death. These justices, those 6 justices, have blood on their hands, will have blood on their hands, and everyone involved in getting those justices appointed will have blood on their hands. And I'm not even sure that this is the most impactful, negatively impactful decision that they've made this week. But this one is directly related to the content. So I just wanted to add that in. But yeah, enjoy the rest of the video, guys.
We're constantly shuffled around Like, you don't get to rest. Like, you're constantly just trying to pay attention and be aware of when everything is going to get destroyed, stolen.
Support service providers for the homeless say people like Oman are suffering the consequences of decades of failed national policy.
We have a broken mental health system. We have a broken foster care system. We have some folks who ended up homeless because of an addiction. We have some folks who start substance misuse once they become homeless.
Now, possible changes to U.S. law could make life more difficult for homeless people.
Only 66% of Americans are homeowners, and affordability is not getting any better. There are approximately 650,000 homeless people in the U.S. And they're treated horribly. They're often treated as subhuman. They're met with violent deterrence. They have their possessions stolen and destroyed. And this includes items such as ID cards, tents, dentures, and even the ashes of loved ones. All right, that's not an exaggeration either. That's a real example, right? So I'm going to say it again and let it resonate for a second. Even the ashes of loved ones. I'll link a really great ProPublica article about this happening in New Mexico. It's a pretty horrifying read, but it is a really good read if you have a chance to look at it. We have staggeringly expensive healthcare costs in the U.S., and the use of private insurance allows these companies to run up premiums, and with the lack of a unified body to collectively bargain on behalf of the American people, it allows Big Pharma to run up drug costs. And finally, I want to retouch on the idea that an increasingly massive portion of the working class's labor value is appropriated as profit, which greatly exacerbates the previously mentioned issues and in itself is an example of capitalism not allowing individuals to own the means of their own labor, which is the whole purpose of Locke's thoughts on property rights. So an argument that someone who disagrees with me might make is that Locke did write about hiring people to labor on your land, and that those laboring on your land did not come to own your land from laboring on it, right? Now, I do see a couple ways to interpret this. Either A, Locke has massively contradicted himself between his labor theory of property and this concept of hiring workers. Or, when Locke wrote these ideas, he understandably lacked the foresight to imagine how society would change after the Industrial Revolution, or even know that an Industrial Revolution was going to happen. And then later, after the commercialization of society and how it has and may continue to change with the digitization of society. And he couldn't have foreseen the extent to which labor would become socialized, specialized, and ultimately collectivized, right? Like what we talked about. And I think his concepts of hiring labor likely did not seem like such a contradiction at the time, because it did constitute a freedom of choice for both parties, because in congruence with the Lockean proviso, it stipulates that those hired still had enough resources left in good and common that they could labor over it and have their own property if they wanted. So this lack of coercion would imply that there is an equal exchange between these two parties. That what the laborer receives in return must be at least equivalent to the labor that they're putting in, or the labor value they are providing. Otherwise, they would just labor over the available resources to claim their own property rights. And really, that's just not the case anymore. You're restricted from accessing your needs of sustenance and survival unless you labor for someone else. You let them appropriate a portion of your labor value and then they pay you what you need to get that sustenance. You work for someone or die. All right, so in my opinion, I do think that while Locke's labor theory of property applied well to the individual of his time, he wasn't able to foresee the extent to which labor would become socialized. But what I do think there's a lot of similarities between is Locke's labor theory of property and Karl Marx's labor theory of value, and furthermore his ideas of exploitation. And the biggest difference that I see is that Locke's is a pre-industrial theory that applies to the individual, while Marx's is a post-industrial theory applied to socialized labor. All right, so Marx got to see capitalism firing on almost all cylinders, and he saw this mass socialization of labor. He recognized the coercion involved and the lack of equal access to natural resources, and he identified the unequal exchange of value between the laborer and the owner. And recognizing these truths and recognizing the extent to which labor has become socialized, he argues that the fruits of the labor should also become socialized, and that the value generated by the workers' socialized labor should not be owned privately, that these private owners should not be able to appropriate the workers' socialized labor as profit, and that the workers should own the fruits of their own labor. So I think where this distinction might be important, while the appropriation of natural resources has become streamlined and socialized, there simply isn't just like a common pool of natural resources for everyone to have equal access to, right? Instead, I think the logical continuation to meet the standards set by the Lockean proviso would be for the workers to have a say in the allocation of those resources, and then rights to the ownership over a portion of those resources, and then ownership over the means of creating products from these resources, and then ownership over the fruits of the product of the socialized labor. So back to the original question. If Locke was here today, would he be a capitalist? Is modern capitalism the logical progression of Locke's ideas, or is the works of Karl Marx a more logical progression of Locke's ideas, shaped to reflect modern society? All right, so it's probably clear what I think, and while it's also probably clear that I have an agenda, which everyone does, and if anyone tells you that they don't, they are lying to you. But my goal here is for everyone watching this video, even those that disagree with me, is for you to walk away from this and approach these concepts and these questions critically, right? So I'm going to leave you off by asking another question, and it's kind of a chicken or the egg question. But are these ideas of liberalism that are inspired by Locke's writings and that our society is foundationally based on and that have become so intertwined and inseparable from capitalism, are these ideas rationalizations for capitalism? Or are these ideas just presented in a very specific way with the intention of capitalism attempting to rationalize itself post hoc? All right, you know the drill, guys. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Throw your questions, comments, concerns, love, hate, everything in between down in the comments. And I love you all. Peace.